Hi, my name is Ben, and today, alongside Alwyn and Caroline, we're going to be talking about monopolies, oligopolies, and monopolistic competition. So, to introduce our topic, I'm going to talk about some of the basics of each of these systems, and also we're going to talk about our own theme, which is why monopolies and oligopolies are killing society. And we chose this theme because we feel that it provides a real life example of economics in everyday life, and it's good for people who are just starting off learning about this because it shows how it relates to everyday life and also the dramatic effects of economics in our world. And further information can be found at our Twitter account, YouTube account, and Instagram account. So here's just a quick overview of the topics we're going to be talking about. And now I'm going to talk about monopolies and just some of the basics. So a monopoly is where one firm dominates the market, and it's represented with, it has a characteristic of high barriers to entry. And there's four main ways in which monopolies can be created. So the first one being where one firm owns a key resource. So for example, in a small town where there's only one petrol station. And the second way is when a government allows a firm to produce something exclusively. And this can be seen through patents, for example, which I'll talk about later in the healthcare system. And also a natural monopoly is the third way, which is where a firm can supply something at a cheaper cost than other firms. And finally, a merger, which is where firms come together and try to elevate the barriers to entry and form a monopoly through this way. So what's the difference between a monopoly and a competitive market? And this one is obvious through the name. The competition in a monopoly is far less than in the competitive market. And also in a competitive market, when the production increases by 1 unit, it receives the market price for that unit. Whereas in a monopoly, when the production increases by 1 unit, the firm must reduce its price for every 1 unit, and this results in greater revenue losses on the units that they were already selling. So are monopolies a positive thing? Well, it depends on the perspective you take. So it's good for the company because they're able to have more control over the market and they're able to establish their own prices, but not for consumers because they would obviously rather a fairer, more competitive price. So the deadweight loss is the socially efficient quantity found when the demand curve and marginal cost curve intersect, and I'll show this later on a graph. So monopoly profit represents a bigger portion for producers and smaller portion for consumers, but overall it remains constant. And it depends on the perspective of the policymakers, whether who is more deserving. One positive example of a monopoly is Systembolaget in Sweden, which is responsible for selling all alcoholic beverages, and this is done in the interest of public health. And it has been proven through research that this prevents a large number of illnesses and homicides every year related to alcohol incidents. So some of the techniques of monopoly is price discrimination, which is where a firm charges two different prices for two different consumers, and it's used to maximize profits. And it takes into account the consumer's willingness to pay for something. And obviously everyone has a unique amount that they're willing to pay. And by charging different prices for different people, they're able to maximize the profits. Also, the second technique is arbitrage, which involves buying low and selling high in another market. And this helps to eliminate inefficiency. So this is the regulation and legislation currently in place to help prevent firms from gaining too much power within monopolies, and these are known as antitrust laws. So these aim to make markets more competitive, they regulate monopoly behavior, and they convert private monopolies into public enterprises. So another example of government intervention is competition laws, and this form of legislation spans over three main areas. So they act against firms who partake in restrictive business practices which prevent free trade. They ban anti-competitive pricing strategies like predatory pricing, price fixing, and gouging. And they monitor acquisitions and joint ventures closely. So if companies are found to be in breach of these laws, they can be fined. So now on to our theme, some of the key insights about why monopolies are killing society. Big firms are making it more difficult for other firms to enter, and the gap between winners and losers is widening. And this is because when firms enter into a monopoly, they're able to erect the barriers to entry, and this makes it harder for other firms to enter. And the market's lack of competition as a result of this is seen from investment is weak relative to profitability, higher profits also. So corporate after-tax profits are almost double what they were 25 years ago, which is a significant increase. And also business dynamism is slowing down. And this is because there's far fewer businesses that are starting up and fewer ones failing because of the fact that there's one firm just dominating the market, and it doesn't provide scope for change. And also, finally, higher prices. So I was going to give another example about the healthcare system as a monopoly and why it's affecting society. So innovation is encouraged through patents, and because when a company produces something, they're able to have up to 20 years of producing it themselves. And also, companies have excess research costs, which is why they need high prices to recoup their losses. However, the problem arises is when they continue to charge these high prices even after their losses are recovered. And this leads to large profits, which people question as immoral because of the fact that they're playing on people who need medicine for life-saving treatment and also just a general better standard of living. So the healthcare system currently, in 2015, Martin Shkreli of Turing firm rose the price of Daraprim, which is an AIDS medicine, from $13.5 to $750. Another example is of how the dramatic effects of monopolies in our society is how if a disease is rare, there's no market for firms to try to produce a cure. And this has been combated by the Orphan Drug Act because they give tax incentives to people who develop cures for these rare diseases. However, there's still many loopholes, and it's clear that the dramatic change is needed to solve this issue of immorality. And finally, the excess wealth that monopolies generate is creating a greater dichotomy between rich and poor. And this is highlighted from the fact that 0.1% of all families in certain countries own as much wealth as the lower 90% of all families combined. So here's just a graph illustrating monopoly. This triangle here represents the deadweight loss. And when the marginal costs are greater than marginal revenue, the firm raises profit by reducing production. When marginal costs equal marginal revenue, profit is maximized. And when marginal cost is less than marginal revenue, the firm increases profits by producing more. So as I was discussing earlier, the deadweight is when the marginal costs and the demand curve meet. And below this quantity, the value to consumers is greater than the marginal cost. So raising output increases total surplus. And above this quantity, marginal cost is greater than value to consumers, and lowering output raises the total surplus. So finally, just an Irish example of a monopoly. There's positives and negatives associated with Iarn Road Éireann. The positives would be that rail wouldn't exist, probably wouldn't exist without a monopoly, since it was originally two firms, but with the introduction of the road networks in Ireland, it would have made it very hard for it to cope with this. And by creating a monopoly, they had greater control over the market and were able to continue their reign. And the negatives is that there's a perception that Iarn Road Éireann is overstaffed, and as a result, it's charging overly high prices and not running at its most efficient. So now I'll pass you over to Alwyn, who's going to talk about oligopolies.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm Alwyn. So some insights onto oligopoly. The danger of oligopoly is that they have such great control over the land and sea. They lack competition, and it has a major impact on the world economy. A lot of industries are becoming oligopolies or showing signs of monopolistic competition. Some of the basics of an oligopoly: there are a few large firms, and they dominate and they control the market. Each firm is independent from one another, but they also independent on each other, and they must act strategically. They must watch closely and consider each other's decisions. The imperfectly competitive market structure of a few large firms selling identical or differentiated products. The techniques of an oligopoly are there are a small number of firms in the market and they're offering similar or identical products and services. They're independent of each other and their behaviours are influenced by each other's actions or as a reaction to someone else as well. So the size of the oligopoly affects the market outcome. And a duopoly is two firms that control over 90% of the market. And we can see an example of one of those later on there. So are they a positive thing for society? Well, cooperation among oligopolists is undesirable as the production is low and the price is too high. So that's not good for consumers. They're also undesirable to consumers as they have greater control than in a competitive market in setting the market price. So they're therefore considered to be price makers. And being so large and so dominant, they influence the quality of the product and services that are available to consumers. So are they killing for society? We could be said that they are, because they have economic and political power, and they prevent other firms from going on to any market. The way that they're able to force price control and the quantity or the quality of the goods on the market leaves the consumer with little or no choice. Reshaping the antitrust framework. So there needs to be a measurement that will stop mergers from forming and set better boundaries for predatory pricing. And an example of this is Amazon dropping baby product prices by 30% and taking over Quizzes' access to market more power. One positive change is how governments in certain countries govern licensing rules and state boundaries that limit dentist practice. More dentists would mean more competition, and that would set fairer prices. The lack of competition stifles innovation and needs to be repaired. There is regulation and legislation, however, around oligopolies. So when they start acting together, it can lead to collusion or cartel. So a collusion is an agreement with firms on the quantities that are produced and on the prices. And a cartel is when a group of firms act in unison. And once these are formed, they act as a monopoly on the market. So governments can prevent oligopoly firms acting like monopolies via regulations such as the Restraint in Trade and Competition Law. And although firms would like to act in collusion or as cartels, this is often prohibited, but it still happens, unfortunately. So we'll look at some examples of some oligopolies. So in the US, you could look at mass media, and the market is held by Walt Disney, Comcast, Viacom, CBS, and News Corporation. The airlines are controlled by American, United, Delta, and Southwest. And if you look at the streaming services in Ireland here, it's Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney. Some examples of some Irish oligopolies are the shipping that is coming in and out of Ireland. They're performed by just two companies, Stellarline and ICG. And the air transport is performed by Ryanair and Aer Lingus, who had tried to set up a merger together, and they would have been a monopoly on the market there, which was prevented from happening, as it wouldn't have been fair to consumers. So it highlights the power these firms have on Ireland as a nation. And since there's only four companies that dominate both air and water transport. So thanks very much. And we're going to hand over to Caroline now, who's going to talk about monopolistic competition.
Thanks, Alwyn. Yeah, my name is Caroline, and I'm talk about monopolistic competition. So it's the definition of it is it's a market structure of large numbers of sellers that sell different products. Suppliers can impact the price given their market force. In this situation, it reduces the consumer surplus and increases the economic surplus of the market, which in turn leads to the deadweight effect. There are four characteristics of monopolistic competition. Large number of small firms, similar but non-identical products sold by the firms, relative freedom of entry into and exit out of the industry, extensive knowledge of prices and technology. Monopolistically competitive markets are called this because there is freedom to enter or exit the market with no large barriers. One of the main advantages of a monopolistic competition is the no restrictions on entry. One of the effects of monopolistic competition on consumers is this market, the price is higher than the marginal cost on the production of goods or services. A monopolistic competitive company in the short run can maximize profits or minimize losses. on production of the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Companies in the monopolistic competition can make economic profits in the short run, whereas they make zero economic profit in the long run. Advertisement industries where there is monopolistic competition, they would rely heavily on advertisements, as each company offers similar production but differentiate through branding and marketing. The correlation of monopolistic competition and monopoly is the two structured markets include a differentiated produce, so companies face a downward sloping demand curve. And that's the end of mine. There's graphs there of monopoly versus monopolistic competition. And I'll pass it back over to Ben, who's going to, is that mine? Effects on consumers. Market price is higher than the marginal cost on the production of goods or services.
So just to conclude, I hope you all enjoyed the presentation. So the learnings from today are, I hope you all have an appreciation of the basic characteristics of each market system and the positives of each. But also you have an appreciation of the negatives of how monopolies and oligopolies can have devastating effects for society, which is seen from the healthcare example of the raising the prices of Daraprim, and also how the rare diseases are not being researched as much. And also I hope you can see recognize the areas for improvement within government regulation and intervention, and hopefully this can be achieved over the next 10 years. And finally, also just to remember that there's further information that can be found at our Twitter account, YouTube account and Instagram account by searching Monop and Oligop. Thank you for your time.